Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021. This is Rudra Das, Executive Director, Center for Adipasi Research and Development. We are proud to announce that this conference is conducted along with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and Ravenshaw University, Cuttack. I welcome our speaker for today, Professor Gary Shapiro, and participants across the globe through Facebook and YouTube Live, and who are here to listen, Professor Gary. The broader theme of this conference is agnotological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy trends. On behalf of Center for Adipasi Research and Development, I extend my profound gratitude to Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Professor Dr. Sanjay Kumar Naik, respected Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University, Cuttack, and Professor Dr. Sarath Kumar Palita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha. The convener of this largest virtual conference, eminent Indian historian, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahi. The main outcome of this conference is to come up with the national and international framework for the education system in future. The crux of this conference will be the use of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and virtual reality that is being increasingly adopted after the outbreak of COVID. We hope this conference would help students, faculties, researchers, and all to expand their mental horizon and help the education system to adopt the best. Ladies and gentlemen, the Center for Adipasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century globe is facing today. The prime agenda of this institution is to come up with potential policy solutions for social change while believing in the idea of debate, dialogue, and discussion, and with expertise, experiencing, and education. The institution focus on marginalized communities and work for their livelihood to protect their nature, culture, language, and identity in particular. The age of modernity has witnessed that change is the only constant phenomena for societal purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodical and avoid paradoxical framework which neglected so many centuries from theory to become practice. The center sincerely believes in the concept of social marketing, which is seriously looking for non-profit marketing and build new social entrepreneurship or check and balance mechanism to glorify generations to come. Center for Adipasi Research and Development come to serve with the holistic approach of critical thinking in education to fill the gaps and to plan accordingly for the voiceless communities. Ladies and gentlemen, in this evening, we have with us an eminent philosopher, Professor Gary Shapiro. Professor Gary Shapiro received his BA and PhD degree from Columbia University, where he was also an instructor in philosophy. After 21 years of teaching at Kansas University, he was appointed to his position at the University of Richmond, becoming emeritus in 2011. Shapiro's research has focused on continental philosophy and the philosophy of art, as well as topics in British empiricism and Nietzsche's art, a great event, great politics in 2016, archaeologies of vision, Foucault and Nietzsche on seeing and saying 2003, Earthwords, Robert Smithson and Art After Babel 1995, Alcyon, Nietzsche on gift, noise and women in 1991, Nietzsche narrative in 1989. Since 2016, Shapiro has published a number of articles on topic including Herman Melville, Nietzsche's and Dostoevsky, and after Dantos aesthetics of place-related art. He has received fellowship from the School of Criticism and Theory, American Council of Laurent Societies, National Humanities Center, and Clark Art Institute. Professor Shapiro has recently been writing and lecturing on philosophical aspects of current controversies concerning monuments and memorials, and on the political aesthetics of land art and landscape architecture in the Anthropocene. Several of his books have been the subject of symposia at academic conferences. A number of Shapiro's articles have appeared in French, German, Italian, and Spanish, Croatian, and Hungarian. Talk on Friedrich Nietzsche and the Anthropocene. So before inviting Professor Gary, I would like to invite Professor Srinivasulu NS from National Law University, West Bengal, to go for a formal welcome and thematic talk on this topic. Over to you, Professor Srinivasulu.
Thank you, Rudranarayan. Thank you very much. A very warm welcome to Professor Gary and all the participants who are part of today's program. At the outset, I am very happy and proud that Center for Adipasi Research and Development has been continuously, without any gap, conducting number of programs as part of the World Human Rights and World Social Sciences and Management Conference. And today we have Professor Gary, who is an expert in the field of philosophy and climate change. As far as climate change and its philosophy is concerned, in the contemporary world, we have got certain debates going on, because climate change is a subject which is concerning everybody. At the same point of time, the contemporary world is concerned with also globalization. When these two issues are collectively debated, we exchange different ideologies and philosophies. And as we have seen in the past 2 or 3 decades, in the context of globalization, climate change is always taking the back seat. Most of the powerful countries who are very much in support of globalization and promoting trade and commerce, they are not that inclined towards promoting climate change or working towards climate change or such other ecological and environmental concerns. And we have a number of agreements, treaties, laws as such with respect to promoting climate change over and beyond the kind of philosophy that we should have and we are currently having as far as social concern is there. At the same time, with respect to globalization also, we have our own philosophy that entire world should be a single global market, and trade and commerce shall be free across the globe, and goods and services be available for one and all across the globe. That is also a concern. But under the garb of promoting globalization, it appears that we are actually sidelining climate change or such other ecological pertinent issues. That is because everyone in this planet today are more concerned about money, revenue, benefit, profit, interest, and economic aspects. Not many people are really concerned with peace of mind, stability, or satisfaction. And we are forgetting one fact that these words that I just uttered, satisfaction, stability, and peace of mind, can't be purchased, can't be sold. However rich you are, you cannot purchase these things. But because these are all concerned with the society, the environment, the Mother Earth, which cannot be looked upon with economic lenses. That one aspect we are actually forgetting at every level of our life. That's the reason why certain countries like Denmark and Norway, they may not be very rich, but still human beings over there, they're very much satisfied. Probably because of the environment, probably because of their concern, commitment towards ecological issues, societal issues. Other countries, they may be very, very rich, Japan, Korea, USA, UK and all, but people over there, even if they are billionaires and millionaires, satisfaction, peace of mind, like people who are in Denmark and Norway, they're not having. So the point that I'm trying to put across before Professor Gary would take over with respect to his talk on philosophy and climate change, I would like to highlight that in the context of globalization or in the contemporary world that we are living in, every time it is happening, that any kind of international debate which we all as international society would like to participate, it always happens that some economic forces, some trade and commerce related forces get their way through by sidelining climate change. With this opening remarks, I would like to once again invite Professor Gary to for this wonderful evening to share his thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you, Bikram, and thank you, Professor Srinivasalu. These are good introductory clarifications having to do with globalization and climate change and the need for thinking beyond narrowly economic considerations as we address the problems of the earth. I was quite impressed when I got this invitation by the context of agnotological studies. And I was tempted for a while to speak about Nietzsche and agnotology. In other words, the study of the production deliberately or accidentally of various forms of ignorance, certainly one of Nietzsche's main topics. He begins one of his major books on the genealogy of morality by saying, we are unknown to ourselves, we who think that we are knowers. And he talks about how individuals defend their inner citadels against even the possibility of self-knowledge. But this would be another topic for another occasion, perhaps. And so I will try to move on more directly to the question of Nietzsche and the Anthropocene. So we mean, of course, by the Anthropocene, in the first instance, a certain geological epoch, one that shows an irreversible effect of human beings upon the earth, the globe that we live on. There's some debate about whether we should say that this epoch begins as long ago as the agricultural revolution, about 12,000 years ago or so, at roughly the end of the last ice age, or whether we should date it much more recently to things like the explosion of atomic weapons beginning in 1945, which produces another kind of geological change, and is also marked now by many scientists as the beginning of what they call the Great Acceleration, not merely human-made changes in the globe, but much more rapidly accumulating sorts of changes. But more generally, as was just indicated in the introduction, we're talking about changes in ecology. We're certainly talking about climate change. We're talking about things like ruinous mining in various communities. And I understand that yours in Odisha has just been observing an anniversary of a rather catastrophic event connected with mining there. We've had recent catastrophic tornadoes in the United States, in Australia, fire on a very large scale following massive floods. We know that massive amounts of CO2 are being released in Antarctica, that ice shelves are melting in the Arctic, that garbage and waste in the oceans is accumulating. And of course, there is now the global pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which could only be taking place in a world that is globalized as ours is, and that is an aspect of the Anthropocene in the way that I'm going to be using the notion. Now, you might very well ask, what could a philosopher who stopped working in 1888, that's when Nietzsche lost his lucid life as a writer and thinker. What could a philosopher who stopped working in 1888 have to tell us about these issues that seem so contemporary? And that's a very natural question. And I'm going to approach it at first by talking about the history, you might say, of images of Nietzsche. Here he is, of course, on the screen. You know, I assume, that he's a German philosopher and thinker of the 19th century. So Nietzsche has always been an explosive and controversial thinker, and the meaning of his thought, or what it has meant on a large scale to interpreters, that has changed over the decades. I will give you the briefest summary, as I see it, of what some of these changes have been. Nietzsche, by the way, if you had a citation index in the 19th century to see who was being read among the philosophers, Nietzsche would have been at the very bottom of that list. And up at the top would be a number of thinkers, some of whom we read now, some of whom we have heard of, some of whom we have probably, most of us, no suspicion who they are. We've heard of people like John Stuart Mill and Auguste Comte, and perhaps Herbert Spencer. They would be up on the top of the citation list, but also on that list would be people like Eduard von Hartmann and Eugen Dühring, German philosophers who were bestsellers during the 19th century, who were targets of Nietzsche's criticism, but whom only specialists know now. So, in the first years after Nietzsche's death, up until about World War I, 1914, he was seen as an iconoclastic, eccentric thinker, certainly a critic of religion. His thoughts were adopted by many people of different persuasions, ranging from anarchists through socialists to aristocrats, and various forms of conservatives. By when World War I started, and the same was true of World War II, here in Europe and the United States, Nietzsche became identified as somehow allied with the German nationalist cause, and it was very difficult to extract his reputation from that view. However, as some of you may know, Nietzsche was also a strong critic of German nationalism, of Bismarck's philosophy, and in fact, spent his life as a stateless person. He left Saxony, a region of Germany, before Bismarck united the country, to live in Switzerland. He never became a Swiss citizen. So he was a stateless person existing on a Swiss passport for most of his life. So as I say, we have the warlike Nietzsche, the image as one image that persists during the time of the two world wars. after the war is over, at least the Second War in the United States, there's an effort to reclaim Nietzsche for what we might call the Cold War ideology. That is, then Nietzsche becomes seen as a advocate of the individual, of individual freedom, of finding yourself, of existentialism. And that was an image that, at least in the English-speaking countries, was widely promoted by the scholar Walter Kaufmann at Princeton. Now, there was also, of course, a German version of Nietzsche, post-war German version, based to a large extent on the writings of Martin Heidegger. And despite Heidegger's own shameful connection with the National Socialists, Heidegger wanted to free Nietzsche from the claim that he was a merely biologistic and racist thinker. That is a whole other very large issue having to do with Nietzsche, but it does present certainly a significant problem. By the 1960s, we had what's known as the new Nietzsche, a form of interpretation that was spearheaded by French thinkers like Gilles Deleuze, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault, where Nietzsche becomes identified as a thinker of difference and plurality, as a thinker who questions language itself, building on his claim that all of language is a system of metaphors and figures of speech. So this became dubbed around 1980 as the phenomenon of the new Nietzsche. Now, recently, there's been a kind of deep contextualist reading of Nietzsche. He's no longer seen simply as a kind of eccentric, solitary thinker, which he himself, an image that he himself, of course, helped to propagate. But we now know much more about his reading and research, and that is part of what brings me into my topic of Nietzsche's relationship to the Anthropocene. By the way, as you'll hear in a little bit, Nietzsche adopts the term the human earth, or in German, Menschen Erde, human earth, which, if you think about it, is a kind of equivalent linguistically of Anthropocene. In other words, an era, a time, a way in which the earth has been structured and transformed by human beings. So that's part of what inspired this book of mine of 5 years ago, Nietzsche's Earth. The illustration, and I'll be coming later to a little talk about this, but this is from an 18th century painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, English painter, of an eruption of Vesuvius. And Vesuvius and earthquakes, volcanic explosions are for Nietzsche, you might say, signature signs of the fact that, as we were just told in the introduction, that the only thing constant about the earth and about experience in general is change. So I use that image because of Nietzsche's fondness for earthquakes and volcanoes. So what I try to argue in this book, I'll try to say something briefly about that, before getting into the more specific content today. I try to say that Nietzsche was already responding to early versions of what we call globalization, to ideas of the end of history. This was a very common theme then, and you may recall that about 30 years ago, at the time of the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, its transformation into contemporary Russia, that there was a lot of talk philosophically, politically, about the end of history, identified with thinkers in the United States anyway, like Francis Fukuyama. In Nietzsche's time, there were philosophers and thinkers like David Strauss and Edward von Hartmann, who were putting forth both optimistic and pessimistic versions of what it meant to be at the end of history. Also in the book, I talk about Nietzsche's criticism of nationalism and the state, his claim that this is the century of the multitude, and that's a term that has generated quite a bit of interest. Some of you may know the book by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri on the multitude, which they regard as a kind of relatively new political concept, even if it goes back to thinkers like Spinoza. That is, the population of the earth in its diversity joined together, or potentially joined together. And Nietzsche already says that the multitude is a diverse audience of spectators, anticipating our world of social media and what some people have called the society of the spectacle. I also investigate Nietzsche's, I think, very forward-looking critique of the rise of an economy of debt, which he traces back to Christianity's adoption of the idea that we are all sinners, debtors in need of redemption. And this leads to measuring time out, amortizing time as a system of debt repayment. And more to the point for today, I argue that Nietzsche envisioned a politics and aesthetics of the earth beyond nationalism, and also beyond mere individualism. More about this later. And I suggest that it's very important to understand that some of his fundamental categories are developed in a kind of dialogue still with the Christian tradition, that is his very political ideas, which he expresses the challenging and dramatic image of the Antichrist, and raises questions like who shall be the Lord of the earth. So today, I'm essentially going to try to address three related topics that I hope will clarify something about Nietzsche's relevance to our thoughts about the Anthropocene. And I just show you an image of a book by a colleague, Henk Manschot, in the Netherlands, to show you that there is continuing work on these topics. All right, but three topics for today. One, to assert that Nietzsche is indeed a philosopher of the earth, and specifically what he calls the human earth. Second, that in his time, Nietzsche was wrestling with a very powerful form of cosmic and environmental pessimism, not quite the same that we are wrestling with today, but analogous to it, and that we might learn something from how he confronted that form of pessimism. The very short label for which, I'll be expanding on this, very short label for that is the fear that the universe was going to run down, that there would be so much entropy in the universe that the sun itself would burn out and everything would freeze. The opposite, you might say, of our worries about global warming. And finally, I want to, third topic, finally, if we have time, I want to say something about how Nietzsche envisioned an Earth that's dedicated to our life as embodied human beings, that is a garden Earth, an Earth, again, to go back to the introductory remarks, an Earth that might actually yield satisfaction. And Nietzsche talks about an Earth that might produce garden happiness for human beings. So let me just tell you or remind you of some of Nietzsche's crucial remarks about the Earth, and then I'll try to elaborate on them. This is from the first speeches that Nietzsche's hero Zarathustra gives in what he regarded as his signature or central book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And as you may know, this is a book in which this wise fellow, but not completely wise, he's still learning through the book, in which this spokesperson, after years of meditation in a cave, comes to talk to people and believes that he has an important message for them, but he himself, we find out, has to learn what his true message is as he goes along. But here's from his first speech. I beseech you, my brothers, stay true to the earth. Do not believe those who talk of over-earthly hopes. They are poison mixers, whether they know it or not. They are despisers of life, moribund and poisoned themselves, of whom the earth is weary. So let them pass on. Once sacrilege against God was the greatest sacrilege, but God died, and thereby the sacrilegious died too. Sacrilege against the earth is now the most terrible thing, and to revere the entrails of the unfathomable more than the sense or meaning or direction of the earth. I say sense, meaning, or direction in the translation here because the German word is Sinn, and although it's conventionally been translated as meaning, what is the meaning of the earth? It can also mean the direction. And I think that is much more appropriate and usable for us as we think about Nietzsche and global crisis. In other words, where is the earth going? Now, the usual, or I'd say up until now, the most usual reading of words like this, Nietzsche's words like this, are he's telling us to lead a realistic life here on earth, to enjoy our bodies, to enjoy everything that has to do with being an embodied being, and forget about the so-called other world, the other world of heaven, hell, purgatory, if you want, that lies beyond us. That is true, but I don't think that it goes far enough. I think that Nietzsche is also conceiving the earth as a political category, not merely as an encouragement to individuals to lead their lives here. And I'll be talking about that more, but Nietzsche goes on to say, or I should say Zarathustra goes on to say, lead as I do the flown away virtue back to the earth, yes, back to the body and life, that it may give Earth its sense, meaning, or direction, a human direction. Unexhausted and undiscovered are the human Earth even now. Verily a site of convalescence shall the Earth yet become, and already a new fragrance wafts about it, bringing health and a new hope. So notice that Nietzsche, or his spokesperson, has said, be loyal to the Earth, be true to the Earth. In other words, don't just live your own life for your own sake of enjoyment. Be loyal to the Earth, to this cause, a cause that the entire human race is involved in. And that contrasts, of course, with other forms of loyalty, such as loyalty to a religion, loyalty to the nation state, which of course was, the prominent form of social organization in Nietzsche's time as it is in ours. Don't be loyal to those things. Even the state, Nietzsche thought, was a kind of shadow of God, insofar as it was thought to be a unifying thing that gave meaning to people's lives. So in general, when Nietzsche talks about the Earth, he's talking about an Earth in which people are mobile, they move around. He's talking about an Earth that itself is in constant change, as well as people on the Earth. When Nietzsche was writing signature book Zarathustra, he was reading works. He was reading works in human geography, for example, by a man named Friedrich Ratzel, who at that time was arguing a rather exceptional thesis that it wasn't being rooted in a particular locality that was essential to human beings, but the fact that they continued to move around the Earth. So the nomad has equal status in this conceptualization with the sedentary state dweller. In all of this, Nietzsche is developing a contrast, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, with the prevailing political philosophies of his time, especially the philosophy of his German predecessor, Hegel. Hegel is famous for his philosophy of world history. In the philosophy of world history, the history of the Earth has a meaning. Hegel says that it arises in the East and finally flourishes at its highest point in the West, that is in Western Europe. And at that point, history has reached its destined end. So world history, Hegel's version, is a history of states, a history of organized political states. And there is no history, Hegel says, without the state. When Nietzsche praises the Earth, he is deliberately trying to develop a contrasting form of political thought. It's not the world, which is important. If you mean by the world the concatenation or assembly of these various political states, it is the Earth. And Nietzsche raises the question, what would it mean for there to be a truly great event of the Earth? What would truly great politics mean? That term, great politics, was very prominent in Nietzsche's time. It was used by Bismarck, the German chancellor, What it meant to Bismarck was we should have a politics that is concerned not with mere domestic questions of internal policy. We should have a politics that looks beyond our individual nation state and plays the large game of politics on an international scale, whether it means war or diplomacy or economic competition. Nietzsche thinks that a truly great politics of the earth would have to involve much more, and it would be a politics that thinks beyond simply the nation state. So more about Nietzsche's context to suggest that he is indeed a philosopher of the earth. In the late 19th century, the world or earth was becoming markedly smaller through a market-driven excess of measurement. Nietzsche was perhaps the first railway philosopher. Not only did he live an itinerant nomadic life, traversing the European continent, corresponding through the bureaucratized postal system, but his thought also responds to the globalization spearheaded by railways, telegraph, and telephone. In the late 19th century, only a few isolated voices speculated about the possibility of the sort of human-induced climate change or global warming and holistic environmental ruin that we know now. Did Nietzsche suspect anything of this? We can find a few tantalizing suggestions. In notebooks from around 1882, that's what's up on the screen now, when he was composing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and reading state-of-the-art books on human geography, he wrote, "We should save or spare the evil as we should save the forest. It's true that the earth will become warmer through thinning and clearing the forest." There were a few other people at the time who said things like this, but Nietzsche, as I might have mentioned before, was a constant walker, hiker, traveler. He was entranced with beautiful and sublime natural surroundings. He sometimes called himself a human barometer. He believed that he was especially sensitive to changes in climate and atmosphere. And he also used that notion metaphorically to talk about himself as a barometer of climate, political climate change. So he attempted to look beyond both the typical smug optimism of 19th century Europe and its flip side, which was melancholy pessimism, thinking not in terms of just the what he called parochial world history, but from the perspective of an absolutely general or universal history. In German, he called it Hauptgeschichte. And thinking on such a large scale, he could even contemplate the possibility of human extinction. So now I want to say something on the second topic, that is Nietzsche's struggle with cosmic and environmental pessimism. Nietzsche's published early two polemical pamphlets, one against a thinker named David Friedrich Strauss, who had first achieved fame as a theological scholar, the second against a popular philosopher, Edward von Hartmann. These were, you might say, the optimistic and pessimistic sides of the prevailing end of history ideology. And now I turn then to concern with this kind of pessimism. And up on the screen is a quotation from a piece that Nietzsche wrote fairly early on, 1873, which has been published as On Truth and Lie in an extramoral sense. And I'm going to explain the background of it after reading it. So a very cynical, pessimistic, if you will, voice is speaking here. And this is a lead-in to an essay about the meaning of human language and what we can really know would be very important for agnotological studies. Anyway, in some remote corner of the universe, flickering in the light of the countless solar systems into which it had been poured, there was once a planet on which clever animals invented cognition. It was the most arrogant and mendacious minute in world history. You notice that world history is in scare quotation marks because Nietzsche is skeptical of the very idea. But a minute was all it was. After nature had just drawn a few more breaths, the planet froze and the clever animals had to die. Why froze? Why froze? Because in the 19th century, there was a very widespread fear that the universe was running down, that entropy was going to take over, and entropy would be, you might say, the modern form, the scientific form of what was previously regarded as religious apocalypse. And today, of course, in a slightly different vein, Nietzsche could have added, well before the sun consumed itself and the planet froze, these all too clever animals deployed their invention of cognition to devise tools, construct engines, overpopulate the earth, make war upon one another on an industrial scale, detonate atomic weapons, pollute lakes, rivers, and oceans, turn forests into wastelands, and exhaust much of the soil. They burn trillions of tons of other animals' fossils, overloading the air with carbon. They overheated their habitat, provoking the sixth great extinction of earthly life, pushing their vaunted civilization to a precarious brink, subjecting many to flood, drought, starvation, and disease. Long before the planet froze, the few survivors declared science and technology to be forbidden practices. World history, if remembered at all, was seen as a sinful episode for which their shrinking populations would be atoning until they too disappeared. And along these lines, in the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the spokesperson encounters a soothsayer, a wise man who can supposedly see the future. And the soothsayer says, in line with this fear of the universe running down, all is empty, all is the same, all has been. In vain was all our work. Our wine has turned to poison. An evil eye has scorched our fields and hearts yellow. Dry have we all become, and should fire fall upon us, we're scattered like ashes. Even fire itself we've made weary. Ah, where is there yet a sea in which we can drown? We've even become too weary to die. So these are worries about the dissipation of energy, of what the 19th century called degeneracy, of what Nietzsche eventually calls nihilism, the fear that everything is collapsing and that there is no point in human effort at all. And now I want to situate Nietzsche more specifically in relationship to this question of entropy. So now I'm going to switch gears to some extent by talking about not just Nietzsche's scientific reading, which he was immersed in, contrary to the image of him as kind of pure individual voice speaking out, but a kind of scientific knowledge and popularization that was extremely important for the entire 19th century. So during the 1840s to 1860s, the physical scientists, Carnot, Clausius, and William Thomson extrapolated consequences from the second law of thermodynamics, which is a thesis that there's a universal tendency for differences between hot and cold to be equalized. Over an indefinite period of time, such equalization would lead to dissipation of energy and dissolution of its organized forms. Entropy involves irreversible disorganization within a closed system, often illustrated by the impossibility of unscrambling a scrambled egg or putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. The 19th century's obsessive concern with entropy was a product of the Industrial Revolution's fossil fuel boom. Scientists observed that usable energy is necessarily dissipated in technological uses, and they formalized their findings. The results of this dissipation were increasingly visible, audible, tactile, and odorous. Great cities became what one critic calls a fog-enclosed world of dust heaps, river sludge, and spent fuel. Charles Dickens gives us many pictures like that of what life was like in 19th century London. Zarathustra confronts these horrors of the Anthropocene in a metropolitan city, where he does not contest the picture that's painted by a frenzied, distraught figure that he encounters there, a figure that's referred to as Zarathustra's ape. The ape says, ape or mimic, says, do you not already smell the slaughterhouses and soup kitchens of the spirit? Does this city not steam with the fumes of slaughtered spirit? And of course, we can today add climate change and pandemic. And as I mentioned, the important role of fossil fuels here, it's important to remember that Nietzsche was a constant railway traveler. Nietzsche was one of the first, you might say, railway philosophers going back and forth across Europe because he had no constant home. And in many ways, his philosophy reflects the fact of this, both his mobility and his closeness to the burning up of these fossil fuels. And this fossil fuel economy led not only to urban blight and pollution, but raised scientific questions concerning energy use, distribution, and its limits. So these led to profound doubts concerning the viability of human existence on Earth. The theories originated in England, inspired by the Industrial Revolution. And while they gained some support in Germany, as in the very famous physicist Helmholtz, they were also resisted by some German physicists and theorists. Nietzsche was immersed in that scientific literature, but he also saw English theory as part and parcel of a certain worldview, a narrowly empiricist, calculating perspective of what he called the nation of shopkeepers. I'll just mention that one of the few philosophers to respond very seriously in political terms to the speculation about entropy was John Stuart Mill, who in his Principles of Political Economy argued that we would eventually be confronting entropy and the exhaustion of resources on a global scale, and that we had to be prepared for a life in which we dispensed with the principle of constant growth and somehow learned to adjust to a steady state economy rather than the frantic rush toward growth of 19th century capitalism. So here's a statement about this dilemma of entropy. In 1852, British physicist William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, wrote, "Within a finite period of time past, the earth must have been, and within a finite period of time to come, the earth must again be, unfit for the habitation of man as at present constituted, unless operations have been or are to be performed, which are impossible under the laws to which the known operations going on at present in the material world are subject." A very formally well-qualified statement. 10 years later, in the 1860s, German physicist Rudolf Clausius coined the term entropy, derived from the word in Greek that means the trope or turning. Nietzsche doesn't use that word, but employs another Clausius coinage, disgregation, in late notes and publications. And people have been puzzled by this word in Nietzsche because it doesn't appear very frequently. But disgregation, invented by Clausius, is the opposite or antonym of aggregation. It's the magnitude of the degree to which a body's molecules are separated from one another. And while Nietzsche uses this term disgregation, he also expands it metaphorically to speak about a kind of social or cultural entropy in which things, so to speak, fall apart and the center does not hold. So he will talk about anarchy of atoms, disgregation of the will, freedom of the individual. He drew parallel between psychological and stylistic disintegration and the physicist's theory of inevitable heat death. So what was Nietzsche's answer to the problem of entropy? Because he was very disturbed by the fact that the culture around him seemed to be going downhill. He saw many signs of decay and degeneration. Perhaps we would disagree with some of his evaluations of what constituted degeneration, such as democratic tendencies. But the point is that he saw his contemporaries as overcome to a large extent by this pessimistic dilemma that the universe was somehow going to run down, lose its energy, that all heat would be equalized, and eventually the sun would burn out. One interesting extreme expression of that sort of fear you can find in H.G. Wells' novel, The Time Machine, where a time traveler goes further and further into the future and sees the sun burning out. So one of Nietzsche's basic answers to the dilemma of entropy was a different theory of the cosmos. And the label for that in Nietzsche's thought is the eternal recurrence of the same. So Nietzsche came up with the following argument, a kind of physical argument, if you will, metaphysical. He says, look, time is infinite. Time is infinite both in the past and in the future. And if time is infinite, then all the possibilities that could have been realized at any point must have been realized at some point in the past. And so if it were possible, as the theorists of entropy say, that the universe is going to run down and the sun will die, then this would have happened already in infinite time. So obviously it hasn't happened. We live in a world of constant change. Therefore, there has been no standstill, and standstill is impossible. And to account for that, we must say that not only is change possible, but given the fact that one state of affairs necessarily produces its successor, that also over an infinite period of time, some state must have recurred again. The laws of probability, of course, dictate that. And if that state, whatever it might be, pick any arbitrary state, had occurred twice, then all of its successor events would also have occurred. So Nietzsche produces what's generally regarded as his most central and puzzling thought in relationship to this kind of fear, pessimism, even hysteria about the Earth being destined to, the Earth and the sun being destined to run down and reach a standstill, the theory of eternal recurrence. And in Nietzsche's published works, what he does is he asks everyone to embrace this thought, which could be terrifying if you think about it. Do you really want to relive all of the events of your life, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant? Or can you somehow jump into that? Can you become a lover of your fate? So in the published works, this is presented as kind of individual challenge, but in his notes, Nietzsche regards it as an important political teaching, so that people will not despair of what the Earth might be. So it's a way of arguing that the Earth itself must have a future. Yet, humans have neglected the Earth. They've been caught up in otherworldly religions, ascetic life-denying practices, or enthralled to the state. Thus spoke Zarathustra tells the story of his accepting his destiny to teach eternal recurrence, despite the fact that humans are making a shambles of the Earth. And there's a very significant passage. I'll just refer you to it, since I see that time is running out, time being one of our topics here. A very important passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a chapter called On Great Events, where Zarathustra seems to confront seems to fly into a volcano. He is seen by his companions to fly into a volcano. It's quite a fantastic passage, though he says, no, that wasn't me. That was just my image. But he says, what really happened was I had a long discussion with a figure that he calls the fire dog or fire hound, who's a kind of political agitator. And political agitator is arguing, that we must do this, that, or the other thing to provoke violent revolutions and so on. And Zarathustra's response was, you've missed completely the question of what a great event is. Great events have to do with the earth. The heart of the earth is golden. Great events creep up on dove's feet. They don't overwhelm us. They don't come from the mouths of agitators. What would truly be a great event of the earth? That's a question I think that Nietzsche poses, if he doesn't answer, a question that he poses and leaves to us, leaves to his posterity to try to make sense of. So let me, again, in the interest of time, try to give just a brief sense of what I meant when I said at the beginning that Nietzsche also projects a sense of an earth satisfactory for human beings, an earth that allows them what he calls a kind of garden happiness. So I tried to say something about how Nietzsche gets to this thought of the eternal recurrence of all things. And again, in the signature book, Zarathustra, Zarathustra has a crucial moment where he falls down into a kind of coma that lasts a week, in which he is struggling to actually embrace and incorporate this thought for himself. He wakes up after a week, overcome, convalescing. In this book, Zarathustra, he has two talking animals as companions, an eagle and a serpent. They sing all kinds of little songs to him about the idea of eternal recurrence. He replies to them, you know, your chattering about all of this is, you know, quite amusing and pleasant, but I don't think you've really, you know, understood the depth of it. But then they say, Zarathustra, get up, because the world awaits you as a garden. The world awaits you as a garden. And, and this is the one thing that Zarathustra accepts when he emerges from this convalescent swoon. And elsewhere in his writings, when Nietzsche gives advice to what he calls free spirits, budding philosophers of the future, he says, please don't forget the garden with the golden trellises. Now, of course, the garden is a powerful traditional symbol of the union or fusion of the natural and the cultural. Yet Nietzsche is quite suspicious of what he calls sentimental attitudes toward that supposed fusion, which might be better understood not as a unity, but as an assemblage or a combination, as a deliberate shaping and arranging of earthly elements. It creates and establishes meaning on the human earth. It's a form of thinking with the earth, a realization of its possibilities, and a mode of giving the earth a direction. And let me just quickly then quickly point out a couple of very interesting passages to you where Nietzsche imagines, and these are, of course, quite ambitious and fantastic imaginings, but I think you'll see where these imaginings come from, where he imagines a future form of the earth, a satisfactory form of the earth, if you will. This is from the book called The Wanderer and His Shadow. Humanity must strive to discover a medical geography for its physical relationships, for the kind of degeneration and illnesses that each region of the earth can cause, and conversely, for the therapeutic factors it offers. And then peoples, families, and individuals must gradually be transplanted for as long and continuously as is necessary for them to master their inherited physical infirmities. The entire earth will, in the end, become a collection of health resorts. And in the very next section of this same book, he goes on to say, what you, with the short-sightedness of old age, that is, you contemporary pessimists who've been overcome by these teachings about entropy, what you, with the short-sightedness of old age, fear to be the overpopulation of the earth, gives into the hands of those who are more hopeful a great task. Humanity should at some point become a tree that overshadows the entire earth, with many billions of blossoms that should all become fruits, one beside the other, and the earth itself should be made ready to nourish this tree. The task is unspeakably great and audacious. So I take this to mean that humans could cultivate green high-rise structures to accommodate growing populations. Nietzsche thinks that we could learn from the insects even in this great experiment. In this passage, and I acknowledge that we could construct several versions of Nietzschean ecology, philosopher takes a strong activist view of how humans can shape the natural environment, says we must look directly at the great task of preparing the earth for a growth in the greatest and happiest fertility, a task of reason and for reason. So there are many, many questions raised by this. If time permitted, I'd say something in more detail about the theme of the garden, which pervades Nietzsche's work, but has not received a great deal of attention. But at this point, I think I'll just bring this to a conclusion with the hope that perhaps you may have some remarks, discussions, questions. So I thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Gary, for a wonderful talk over Nietzsche's Anthropocene. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Sobenbach for a quick comment on Professor Gary's talk.
Hello.
Over to Dr. Sobenbach.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Professor Gary. It was really wonderful to listen to you, and my tasks is a little bit difficult right now because when I have been asked to give a quick comment, it's really very difficult in a sense that after listening to you and of course the very prominent philosopher of our time, and I must say the legendary philosopher, to quickly give remark on his philosophy, and that too after having a very in-depth and insightful talk from you, my task is really very difficult right now. But anyway, let me to have a sort of reflection of what I have understood and how do I see, given the presentation that you have said about Nietzsche's philosophy, his work, his ideas, and his his philosophical thought and its relevancy in the present day. Let me to take it to a different parameter altogether also, because as we are from India, and particularly we do have also different philosophers, and most of our philosophers, particularly when I talk about Gandhiji, he has been also predominantly influenced by Nietzsche's idea. And one of the very core idea which I find similar to Nietzsche's philosophy and Gandhi, who is called the father of nation, particularly India, is truth. And that is what one of the very common and very critical point of merger, I would say, and very relevant in present day also. And given this, Nietzsche has also said that truth is not an elephant to be looked from different perspectives, right? And rather, it is simply the power to enforce their point of view. And the same thing has been, placed by Gandhi, is that non-violence is not the power of a coward people. Rather, it is something that we expect from the brave people, right? So, taking this to our point of discussion, you have very rightly said that now with the emergence of different, thought, which is to be large extent is controlled and influenced by the economic power, and of course the run for power and the lust for position has deeply influenced the entire socio-economic and the social setup. The social order, the social hierarchy to a large extent has been affected by this so-called lust for power, right? And you have very rightly said that this has also taken us to a new height to reinvent reality. How do we perceive reality? How do we think reality, right? And at one point of time, we also see that in the search of reality, or like um, to understand reality, somewhere we are losing another aspect, that is morality, which is very much highlighted by Nietzsche in his different work as well, right? Who says that the only reality is the will to power, and truth, like morality, is just another fig leaf placed on top of this reality, right? And you have very rightly said that with the present society, where we have been very much disturbed from the pandemic, the global economic slowdown, so on and so forth, it has also given us another space and opportunity, I would say, to think and to you know uh, reflect upon Nietzsche's philosophy, which is very much relevant and contextual even in present days. Although he was all the way from Germany and was belonging to 18th century, I would say, but his ideas, his thought is very much pertinent and very much important in the days when we talk about the present development scenario. You have also said about the different doctrines and the conception about truth, his uh, you know uh, revaluation of values, and several other things. Now, the only question, or in fact I would say my reflection would be in the form of request from you. Now, how do you see the relevancy of Nietzsche's philosophy in terms of its practical application when we talk about a global society? Because at one point of time, where we are talking about development, we have also divided and we have disturbed the entire global peace in the name of development. Look at the different countries who have altogether formed their own world, like the superpowers, so-called superpowers, and the concentration of wealth or economy in the name of development has altogether disturbed this entire human values that we are talking about. So where do you see, or how will you reflect on this contemporary the practice that is being dominated by the so-called superpowers, given the fact that now we have altogether come, and in fact we are still struggling with such a disaster that has taught a lot of things, which was long back hinted by philosophers like Nietzsche. So how do you see, Professor, that what should be the call for so-called developed nation, and I would say how do we perceive as a human being, as an individual capacity to address those kind of things? Number one. Number two is that, do you think, or don't you think, like it is a sort of individual exercise that has to be internalized, that has to be, owned. And when we talk about this kind of thing, how do you see, or what will be your reflection to bring this kind of philosophy in our curriculum, right? So if we are planning for a world which is full of such kind of philosophical things, and we are thinking for global peace, prosperity, humanity, so on and so forth, the very bottom thing that we have to really think, and we have to redesign, is our curriculum. So how do you see, or what sort of strategy should be taken at the school level to integrate his philosophy in curriculum? Of course, one thing is that as an individual we have to teach, and the other thing is from curriculum point of view. So Professor Gary, if you could enlighten us on those two things, I'll be really happy. And thank you so much for giving us such a wonderful talk, and once again making us or compelling us to think that the point that was made by Nietzsche long back is still prevalent and very much important when we talk about the global society. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Shravan Bag, for a whole host of provocations and questions here, which I wish I were able to ably answer. So I will venture just a few thoughts that I agree, of course, that Gandhi is a figure of towering importance. I wasn't aware that he had studied Nietzsche, but I'm not surprised. Nietzsche made a number of gestures in his time toward thinking more globally, not just in terms of thinking about the inhabited earth as a whole, but also thinking about the differences and interactions among various cultures. He aspired to think with what he called a trans-European eye, and although viewing him from our present perspective, of course we can see him as limited by a number of Eurocentric prejudices. Nevertheless, he was somewhat informed about Hinduism, Buddhism, and other philosophies and religions of the East, at least relative to thinkers of his time. And this he was partly inspired by his predecessor, Schopenhauer. So one place, of course, where Nietzsche and Gandhi and some other thinkers of India and the East might, and the global South might agree would be in the criticism of neoliberalism and the mere lust for economic power and growth. This was his criticism, for example, of English society at the time of the heyday of British imperialism. So in that sense, I suppose Gandhi and Nietzsche were on similar sides, or at least they shared, you could say, a kind of common enemy. You mentioned the Nietzsche's famous doctrine of the will to power, and isn't the will to power, a critic might say, isn't the will to power simply a kind of legitimation for grab whatever you can, no matter what the consequences are? And I will just say that for Nietzsche, the will to power is for him not so much a truth of individual human psychology, but a more general cosmic kind of principle. That is, everything strives for a will to maximize its power. But that means that even the parts of the individual strive among themselves. So Nietzsche was in many ways a critic of individualism. That is, he believed that the self, as we understand it, is largely, well, as self as we should understand it, is largely unconscious, bodily, and composed of a variety of conflicting impulses, and they are brought together in a rather fragile, networked kind of arrangement where there are shifting centers of power. So it's important to see that this idea of the will to power goes all the way down. It's not attached simply to individual human beings. It's one, a cosmic truth, and second, it helps us see that our very idea of the individual as a single, stable psychological unit is somewhat mistaken, and that undercuts in some ways the foundations of neoliberalism. If neoliberalism is all about the individual. You've asked, and it's a wonderful challenge and question. You've asked Shravan Bagh, what is usable? What practical applications might come from somebody like Nietzsche? And then more specifically, what can we do at the school level? Because I gather that most of us here are educators in one way or another. Well, perhaps this is a very small thing that I'll mention, but we read again not only the history of philosophy, as I've tried to do with Nietzsche, but also works of literature and history in terms of their ecological meanings. We, along with thinkers like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who praise Nietzsche as the inventor of geophilosophy, we try to think not only in terms of history, but geography. How are human beings spread out on the earth? How do they relate to one another? We transform our curricula so that we understand what it is to be situated in an environment, what it is to live with all of the other living beings that we are necessarily in connection with. So I think there's a vast room, a vast space available for rethinking our traditions. Now, there are many, many other things that can be done. If I were a practicing scientist, or if I were involved in population studies, there'd be many specific recommendations, I suppose, that I might have as a historian, essentially, of thought. Those are mine. One more thing, I'm sorry that my response is a little bit miscellaneous to your many questions. One more thing I'll mention is that so far as Nietzsche talks about the will to power and overcoming, he is not just recommending or urging individuals to have power over other individuals or groups. He's talking about overcoming oneself, most significantly and most importantly. How does one for example, if someone has been raised according to principles of egoistic neoliberalism, to overcome oneself would be to think and feel in a way that takes us beyond that limited perspective.
Thank you so much, Professor Gary.
Thank you so
It was
much.
wonderful to listen to you. And
Thank
yes,
you.
yeah, and you are absolutely correct that at some point of time, we not only have to learn, but we also have to internalize, we have to own, we have to take it to a different level altogether to translate the philosophy into practice. It's absolutely correct. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Bag and Professor Gary. And now I would like to invite Mr. San Kashyap to go for a quick remark. And if he have any questions, then directly ask to Professor Gary. Over to San.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor. I think I read your Nietzsche's Earth, Great Event, Great Politics some 2 years back. And some of the themes which I come back as a student of history, but perhaps engaged at, brilliantly written monographs, so such a lyrical prose. So as a student of history, let me just engage these three themes of space, time, and theme, which runs in this brilliant book. I remember somewhere just right in the first chapter, it comes as if, and you're right, that Earth, I want to suggest, is not much that a loss of Nietzsche's own, meta-narrative as a signature of the alternatives to meta-narrative, a genre he sees as essentially Christian. And then with relation to that, it just, if we assume Earth as a space, what does it say about the temporality? And the discussion further, moves ahead in the direction where there is an involvement of a rejection of world history and its claims to have understood the structure of time through Nietzsche. And then with the theme, which, ultimately all of it somehow converges in Anthropocene, is that I think in chapter 3rd or 4th, there is this discussion about, human beings, in this exchange of creditors and debtors. You write to live life and deaths, the relation, something like that. Now, one thing which I kept asking while reading this book, and perhaps it also didn't come much in the talk, so if you might reflect on it, if we really talk about the absence of certain telos in Nietzsche, which becomes very, clear in Hegel's world history movement, the introduction of something like Übermensch as some kind of a, superior goal through which the humanity has been persuaded to, advance. Can we imagine the possibility of a conversation or a dialogue between the last man and the Übermensch in the moment of Anthropocene? Or has the Übermensch contributed in some way in creation of the moment of Anthropocene? So if you could just reflect on that. And then there's this question, the very added question of temporality, that the operation of Übermensch it's the functions of Übermensch in returnal occurrences. The concept of eternal occurrences is actually based on the infinitude. But what Anthropocene has taught us right in the moment is about the finitude of time, as some of the historians have started arguing. So how does these two contradictions really interact in this particular moment? Has a Übermensch really lost its agency when the agency in the Anthropocene is really geological? Or is he still able to get things done, get the ideals right on the table? Thank you.
More wonderful questions and challenges. So I think, first of all, of course, I'm very grateful and pleased to know that you've read the book and that it's gotten circulation so far. And you're absolutely right. to talk about the importance of Nietzsche's challenging conventional conceptions of time, that he is an opponent of the notion of a single linear direction of world history. And I try to argue in the book that in fact, Nietzsche does not have a single conception of time, that we find ourselves living time in different layers or strata. I mean, the time of individual passion, but also the time of large-scale geological events that we find ourselves caught up in. So rather than talking about world history, we talk about this earth that we live on. So you're absolutely right to focus on that. And one of the unfortunate ways in which time has been organized that you've just alluded to, Sean Kashyap, one of the ways time is organized has to do in daily life in our most of our societies, has to do with an economy of debt. When you take on a debt, you owe something, and that means that you have to regulate your life in terms of paying off the debt. And for many people, even in relatively wealthy countries, this becomes a huge burden, and it eliminates or minimizes the possibility of a kind of joyous acceptance relationship to the present, to the world that unfolds around them. So, and Nietzsche even in his, you might say, genealogy of religion shows that this psychology of debt even precedes the invention or introduction of money. You know, people are become, let's say, sharecrop farmers obligated to produce a certain amount for the feudal owner of the land. And again, their seasons, their time become totally managed in terms of that larger structure. You've asked some questions about the Übermensch and the last man. Now, readers of Nietzsche will know that that Zarathustra, when he appears to the crowds, first begins his teaching by talking about what he foresees as a terrible future, possibility of a terrible future that would involve the triumph or the prevalence of what he calls the last human being. By the way, a lot of the words that get translated as man, at least in the English versions, are human in the German Mensch rather than Mann, for example. So the overhuman is the antithesis of the last human. The last human is nothing but a kind of cog in a kind of great machine. The last human has his or her, as Zarathustra says, little pleasure for the day, little pleasure for the night. The last human does not want to go to any extremes. The last human simply wants very basic and limited satisfactions and does not want any challenges. So this is a kind of, you might say, human entropy or degeneration. In other words, just as the physicists of Nietzsche's time projected that the physical world was going to gradually level off in such a way that energy would be dissipated So Nietzsche sees a sociological version, if you will, of this in the idea that humans will be leveled off in that way, not just in the sense of equality. And of course, there are many problems with Nietzsche's rejection of equality, but not just in the sense of equality, but in the sense of leveling off of aspirations or creativity. So the overhuman, which he praises and which he suggests is the sense or the direction of the earth, is the one who is not simply over in the sense of dominating others, which has been the one traditional understanding of Nietzsche, but one who has gone beyond the merely human, one who's gone beyond the merely human. Now, in speaking to an Indian audience, I am somewhat hesitant to talk about Nietzsche's borrowing from Sanskrit etymology, but you know, in a book called The Genealogy of Morality, where Nietzsche is elaborating his idea of civilization and history as based on the economy of debt, he says that the German word Mensch, that is human being, the German word Mensch is derived from the Sanskrit manas, and then he suggests the etymology, which he may have gotten from some of his friends who were Sanskrit scholars, a man named Paul Deussen in particular, suggests the etymology that that manas means the measurer, the one who measures things. And he criticizes a psychology or an anthropology, a way of life that involves excessive measurement. And part of what the problem with the last man, last human, is that the last human wants to measure everything and calculate and reduce it to exchangeable measures. And that's also very compatible with his critique in the 19th century of what he sees as British civilization, what he calls the nation of shopkeepers. So to extend that a little bit, whether Nietzsche's etymology is plausible or not, I leave to people with more expertise. But at least what he seems to have meant to say is that the overhuman, at least in part, the overhuman is the one who is no longer so addicted to measure and calculation. The overhuman lives in terms of what we called before satisfaction, joy, affective relationship with the environing world, the environing earth, rather than simply calculating, as one does, for example, in the world of debt. So what we mean by, what we might mean by the overhuman, I think is, first of all, it's relatively undefined in Nietzsche. What will the overhuman be? But to the extent that we get some indications of it, it is to live without this addiction to constant measurement. But I invite other questions.
Thank you, Professor Gary. Now I would like to invite Dr. Vikram Jena.
Rudra, please ask questions for sir.
Shubham
Please
Das,
read out all
please
questions.
go for the question. I don't have. Shubham Das, please go to the question.
Thank you, Rudra. One question is asked by Dr. Neha Sharma. The perfect human, the prophet Zarathustra is very difficult to imagine in the doubleness of human behavior towards planet, and two perspectives which have been drawn by Professor Dipesh Chakravarti. One, when human as an individual can problematize, discuss things, live happily, love and write poetry, but in a upper order where he reduced to a creature, a thing, when he compete with other life of earth for resources, the technosphere enabling human and reducing to human as a thing, not a superhuman. How can Nietzsche's superhuman is a realistic existence in the age of Anthropocene? So human are more inquisitive towards the defeating death rather accepting it. In the regard of Google multi-million project to solve the death, superhuman of future is more like post-human or meta-human.
Yes, another question about the overhuman or the post-human. I'll just say again that Nietzsche's conception of the overhuman is a very open-ended, aspirational sort of concept or goal. That there is no blueprint, there is no obvious pattern that the overhuman should fulfill. I think it's best seen as a kind of call for Nietzsche's readers to overcome what is limited about themselves, to go beyond. The German is helpful here. It's the Übermensch, the Hypermensch, the one that goes beyond various sorts of limits. What would it mean to go beyond these limits in the Anthropocene? Well, it might mean to, paradoxical as this might sound, to go beyond the limits of the culture of, say, neoliberalism and ultra individuality in such a way that you live fully with your surrounding environment. By the way, there's nothing in Nietzsche to suggest that the Übermensch, the overhuman, is going to take simply the form of recognizable human, what we now think of as a recognizable human individual. Why couldn't the overhuman be a club or association of separate human bodies? Why couldn't the overhuman be, a cyborg, as people now talk about the transhuman and possibilities of human technological sorts of union? Why couldn't the overhuman be one that had somehow transcended the narrow human prejudice or division between humans and other animals? Nietzsche is always stressing that human beings are animals, and not only animals, they are also in many ways plant-like. So the overhuman might be one that in some sense goes beyond this. So although I don't have specific ideas about what the overhuman might be, I will say that it's a strength of Nietzsche's thought, and this applies to, I think, many other categories as well. It's a strength of Nietzsche's thought, I believe, that he emphasizes the unknown aspect of the future. Again, if I can play with German a little bit, you know, the future in German is the Zukunft, that which is to manifest itself, that which is to arrive. And that is something that is unpredictable. French has a similar sort of expression. So it's, we might say, it's the idea of not so much the future, as if the future is something that can be understood or predicted in its content, the way that a culture of calculation might believe. It's, for Nietzsche, what's important is the idea of futurity, that for futureness, if you want, that is, that there always is a future. How his book called Beyond Good and Evil has as a subtitle, a prelude to a philosophy of the future, meaning not so much, I've got a secret philosophy here for the future, but let us think in terms of futurity. What would it be like to think not in terms of, as the 19th century was thinking, the end of history, the way that the Hegelians did, or the running down of history and the universe as those advocates of the theory of entropy did. What would it mean to think in terms of a truly open future? How do we keep that concept alive? How do we revivify that concept? And that, I think, is the most productive way for me of reading this notion of the Übermensch, or overhuman, or posthuman.
Thank you, Eri. I have two questions. How do you look at the policy paradigm of the third world countries like India, who are forced to frame their policies as per the agenda set by the multinational agencies like the World Bank or say the WTO, who are also facilitating the developed countries to outsource their most extractive industries to the third world countries, where the environment has always been remain a low priority so far as the legislation or the policy perspective are concerned? And how do you look at the third world countries who are inviting the MNCs at the cost of their environment in order to pay off their debt? How do you look at this?
Clearly, these are major problems for global life these days. I am not a policy analyst. I have a great deal of respect for life in India. I had one visit to India for a period of 3 weeks, so obviously I was only able to see a few things of such a vast and diverse subcontinent. I can't claim to be informed about, or deeply informed about current Indian policies, though I know that there are great matters of controversy and great regional differences. And I know that Odisha has a special mission in relationship to the native or indigenous people, what we sometimes call First Nations in the United States. And I mean, I myself here in Virginia am living on land that was originally that of a number of First Nations, of Powhatan and Monacan and other nations that still exist. And we are constantly negotiating, what the relationships are between those who have come as immigrants and their descendants, and those of the First Nations. So in terms of policy similarities, I certainly see that these must be somewhat analogous tasks for those of us, on these two different sides of the planet. You also mentioned outsourcing as a problem. Certainly, it would seem that this is a unfortunate form of exploitation by one economic group in relationship to another. Whether there's some room for international trade and commerce, one would think that that is inevitable in our globalized situation, but how it can be humanized, I see as a great task or problem. And I know that in your series of talks, I know that many people have been concerned with these issues. I didn't undertake to address those or make a study of it, but I certainly support the efforts of those who are doing that.
Yes, sir. And also the denial of the climate change by the dominant development discourse is also a potent threat to the very existence of the planetary life nowadays. So how do you problematize climate crisis in this Anthropocene epoch? And what do you think will be more appropriate to define the present epoch as Anthropocene or Capitalocene? Which will be more appropriate, according to you?
Could you restate that? You're saying, are you asking which is more significant?
Yes, which will be more appropriate to say this
opposition
present
to
epoch?
climate denial
Yes.
or opposition to capitalism?
Yes.
Well, they would certainly seem to be very closely related. So just off the top of my head, that is, I know that climate denialism, at least in the United States, and I would imagine in other countries too, that climate denialism was at first vigorously promoted by capitalist interests, by even more specifically, fossil fuel interests. It's a very large and great question about which I have no special expertise, but I do have a passion and interest in the question of whether it's possible for energy production to be done on a sustainable, resilient basis, whether we can switch from fossil fuels to solar power, wind power, geothermal power, and so on. And I know that it's a subject of great debate to what extent some kind of modified capitalist system could accommodate this switch. People have conflicting notions about that. My personal intuition, although I can't say that I support this with any deep argument, my personal intuition is that human beings as a whole across the globe are so unfortunately distracted by their relatively local concerns and problems, that it's only going to be massive climate-driven events that are going to finally force us, that is us meaning everyone, force us to adopt new systems and new ways of dealing with the earth. In other words, I think we, so to speak, have to sort of get hit over the head by massive events, some of which, of course, involve huge movements of people, climate-driven refugees, climate-driven immigration, which is already, of course, happening across the earth as many areas become deserts or unhealthy or unlivable. So I hold up Nietzsche's idea, you may call it a fantasy, but his idea of a kind of a green earth, one that somehow expands like a great tree up into the sunlight to accommodate vast amounts of people. But I think that the only way that there'll be any movement toward that, or whatever the contemporary equivalent might be, given our scientific and technological possibilities, will be from now relatively unpredictable catastrophes.
Dr. Jena had a question for you. How you locate the shifting ideology of governmentality in a challenging planet today? Do you agree academics is a small cup of tea in these days when the pedagogical practices distancing activism per se to the agnotological contest and epistemological violence to disturb the nature and culture, both again more challenging by the way of approach made by the state these days, like the prejudice by nature and the clientelism of metaphoric by the discipline itself? At the same time, he has asked another supplementary question: mining mafias and corporate tycoons can save our earth in terms of supply their developmental philosophy of this crisis planet? How to answer small fundamental questions of heal people when you see the problems of the life world is concerned? This is the question.
Well, if I understand properly, this is a very far-ranging question, which I wish I were able to respond to in more depth or more detail. As I say, I am not a student of global political economy. I wish that I were, more learned in depth in this way. All I can do from my little perspective is to try to I'm trying to rethink what some of perhaps a small part of the human heritage has tried to work on. So Nietzsche, the 19th century, I'm trying to see whether we can draw any lessons from the sorts of extremes of optimism and pessimism that we've experienced before, in order to at least face a future that is really to come, that we know certain very, very general things about. We know that it's not going to be easy. We know that we have massive inequalities in the East, the West, the North, the South, that will eventually sooner rather than later have to be dealt with. How can we develop our mindsets to begin to deal with those things? I approach this from my little corner.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gary, for a very insightful talk and very wonderful
I think
answers.
Kashyap is raising hand for something.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. There's just like one more question. Professor, since Anthropocene, there's this growing interest in animal studies, and we are making some space for the incoming of non-humans as well. So, I read this paper, Earth's Garden Happiness, where you make some space through Nietzsche about this garden being a site of refuge for philosophers and a few friends, and the right time for large-scale cultivation is still to come. So can you please educate us a little that how someone, let's say a student of history, would make space for non-humans in historical narratives through Nietzsche?
Yes. Okay. So I think that the talk about the garden as place for the philosopher and his friends, this is a certain heritage from Greek Epicurean philosophy that Nietzsche sometimes cites, something that one could take away from the history of Greek thought. Epicurus, was famed for retreating to his garden rather than becoming a public teacher, the way that Plato, Aristotle, and a number of the other Greek philosophers did. So the garden was a place to enjoy the the environment. Now, as far as I know, there's no mention of animals in the garden of Epicurus. Nietzsche, however, was certainly an observer of animal life and constantly pointed out the animal, the characteristics that human beings share with other animals. There is actually a very nice collection of essays called a Nietzschean bestiary that in which a number of contributors, including myself, have written little essays about how Nietzsche understands or employs the figure of a number of animals, including cats, dogs, snakes, birds of various sorts. So certainly in Nietzsche's, shall we call it, his dreamlike or his fantasy life of the garden, because a lot of it is a kind of fantasy or imagination. And by calling it that, I don't mean to disparage it or minimize it, because fantasy, imagination are fundamental parts of our life. And in his, certainly in his imagination, the animal plays a very large part. And I'll just mention one aspect of this that I've spent some time thinking about, and that is, he says at one point, this takes a little background, but he says at one point that you haven't understood his central work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, unless you've heard the halcyon tone in which it is said or sometimes sung. What is the halcyon? The halcyon is the Kingfisher bird. And there's a myth about the Kingfisher bird in Greek and Roman mythology anyway, that it is the Kingfisher was a woman, Alcyone by name, who was transformed into a bird because her husband was lost at sea, and she threw herself into the sea, drowned, and then the gods took pity on her and changed them both into seabirds that live and nest at sea and actually even give birth to their young in a kind of miraculous floating nest. And her song was rumored, believed to be both incredibly sweet and incredibly sad. So in other words, Nietzsche associates himself with an animal cry, an animal voice. When we sing, and Nietzsche, one of the things that a lot of people understand about Nietzsche is that he was a musical person, and in fact said that life without music would be a mistake. And so the very music of the animals was important to him, to be surrounded by this. I spoke Zarathustra. Again, it's a mythical or fantastic setting. He's accompanied always by his animals that represent the eagle's pride and the cunning of the serpent. A few thoughts about Nietzsche and animals.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your very enlightening and very informative session. Perhaps it is the longest session of our Mapping Mind global talk, and it's a very wonderful, insightful, and a very informal way you spoke about more than 2.15 minutes. Perhaps we can go to conclude part of the session. I have 2-3 questions, but I don't want to push because already you have spent so much time with you. Now I'd like to request Rudranarayan to go for a formal vote of thanks as well. And thank you so much, sir. Really, really wonderful.
Well, thank you. And I have tried to take some notes on the various questions, and I'm sure that they will give me food for thought. I thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jena. On behalf of Center for Adipasi Research and Development, I take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks to those who have directly or indirectly contributed to World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021. At the outset, I thank our guest speaker, Professor Gary Shapiro. We are really enlightened with your deliverance on your topic, Friedrich Nietzsche's and the Anthropocene, and also you very much wonderfully theorizing it in a very lucid manner. We are very thankful to our coordinating institutions, Indian Institute of Management Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, for their support to organize this virtual event. I would like to thank Professor Dr. Sanjay Nayak, respected Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University, Professor Sarath Kumar Palita, respected Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, and Professor Mahadev Joyswal, Director, IIM Sambalpur, Dr. Bikram Jena, Director, Center for Adipasi Research and Development. I would like to thank our conveners, Professor Dr. Chandi Prasad Nanda and Professor Charudat Panigrahi, for their motivation and guidance. A special thanks to all the organizing committee members, Professor Srinivasulu NS, Dr. Sudarshan Misra, Professor Loknath Misra, Professor B.C. Das, Professor Shravan Bag, Dr. Nupur Patnaik, Dr. Amulya Acharya, Professor Shubham Das, Chinmay Sahu, Dr. Kamal Prasad Mahanti, Dr. Samuel Lima, Dr. Neha Sharma, Mr. Shan Kashyap, for their unflinching support and coordination. Our heartfelt thanks to all the academicians, research scholars, and students for their active participations. With these warm words, and thanking Professor Gary for their enlightenment session, I would like to conclude the meeting. Thank you. Thank you all.